In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.
I'm Bill Dries, joined by Sam Hardiman of the Daily Memphian for some post-election thoughts and analysis. This is On the Record. We record this Monday, October 9th, 2023. The election, of course, was October 5th, although we still have runoffs to come on November 16th for 3 city council positions. So 4 days after the election, we're all really tired, to be honest with you. But we're going to talk some about some themes that have emerged now that folks have had a few days to think about what happened and why it happened. Sam, your initial thoughts. What is really pressing on your mind at this point?
Well, like you said, Bill, how tired I am is front and center. Second, what I think about is obviously history gets written from the side of the victor, right? Paul Young won. He's the next mayor of Memphis. But I keep going back to how we had this 17-candidate race, and there was a lot of talk. I said it a lot. You may have said it, that we're going to have a lot of vote splitting, that there were just going to be random people getting high percentages of the vote, low single digits % of the vote, and that was going to change the nature of the race. That didn't really happen. 4 candidates got a combined 95% of the vote. That, to me, kind of sticks in my head, that how voters really sorted for themselves and picked between 1 and 4 visions of the city.
Mm-hmm. Right. And there were different hypotheses out there about what was going to happen. And that was one of them. And it really wasn't borne out by past races, because if you look at, we've had some pretty big fields for mayoral races here, the record being 25 in the 2009 special election. If you look at that, or you look at some of the other 10 candidate affairs, the minor candidates didn't even get 1% each. So much for the theories that, well, if you just get out there and run, you'll get 1 to 5% of the vote. It doesn't work that way. And I think it tends to show that voters for some time now in the city have been sorting this out themselves when confronted with with a lot of contenders on the ballot.
That's right. What else are you thinking about, though?
Well, there was also a lot of talk, as we both heard, about people saying, well, the person who wins this race is going to win it with 25,000 or so votes. And that turned out to be true. 24,408 votes for Paul Young, the winning total by the unofficial results. 25,000 votes did wind up deciding the mayor's race in that field, although we had several major contenders. And a few stats on that. This amounts to, let me flip some pages here so you know I'm looking at information. This amounts to a 23.77% total turnout of voters at 88,668. About 57,000 of those votes were the early vote. This is the lowest total that a mayoral candidate has won an election by in a city election since we went to the mayor-council form of government with the 1967 elections. The next or the previous record holder for the lowest vote total in winning a mayor's race, who would you guess?
Oh, it's a trivia question?
Mm-hmm.
Let me think about it. I think that's Strickland, 2015.
Yes. Jim Strickland in 2015 got 41,829 votes. That was the previous low total.
So 17,000 more votes than Paul Young got.
Mm-hmm.
That's wild.
And 17,000 is a significant
How
number.
many people voted in the 2015 race?
In the 2015 election, you had 102,176 for a 28% turnout. So the turnout this year really isn't that unusual. I mean, we did 18% in 2011. We did 17.4% in 2003. 2003 is the middle of Harrington's 5 terms of office, being elected mayor 5 times. 2011 was when A.C. Wharton, that very, very brief period when A.C. Wharton was invincible, was the consensus mayor via the special election in 2009. 2011, he went for a full 4-year term. 4 short years later, he's upset by Jim Strickland.
And so should we take anything away from the fact that 14,000 fewer people voted for Jim Strickland in 2015, would voted total in 2015, than the 88,000 this time? Should we take that? I mean, because I look at the total, and the total is just so, like 88,000 people in a city of 630,000, in a city where 373,000 people are registered to vote. And I understand that's not far off from past times, and it's actually outpaces some of them, as you just outlined. But that's still like not a lot of people.
Well, and early voting did create some excitement, as it's done in past years, not just on this election cycle, but even in like the presidential election cycle, which is the one election cycle we have locally that still draws a majority of the voters out. But nevertheless, a lot of excitement about early voting. Oh, people are really turning out. Surely Election Day we'll see a healthy turnout as well. Nope. What ends up happening is Election Day is flat after you get this. I mean, we had this surge on the last day of early voting, the Saturday, and that portended well, some people thought, for Election Day, but it turned out to be the same pattern. Election Day is really not a big whoop, it turns out.
Yeah, and we definitely saw this in 2020. Right? When people really, I think, sort of, it seemed to me, and we don't have like hard data to prove it or why people changed it, but it seemed to change their habits. COVID changed their habits. Of early voting was seen as, when you're avoiding the virus, seen as safer, and so people really used early voting. And now Memphis voters just seem to be in the habit of, okay, we got 2 weeks to early vote, we're going to go do that, and you're going to see kind of a group of people come on Election Day that are holdouts. I voted on Election Day. I'm typically an early voter, but it does seem like from now on, we should almost count on 70% of the city's turnout being in early voting and really thinking about it like this is the cake being baked. And those 2 weeks are sort of the race, less so that week before Election Day.
Linda Phillips, the Shelby County Elections Administrator, her theory was that voters had a hard time figuring out who they were going to vote for in this. Any credence to that, do you think?
I think we saw it in some of the polling, right? There was a late poll from Hart Research, and forgive me because of my lack of sleep, I don't remember who paid for it. But it was a poll which showed, in early September, there was 23% undecided.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. A quarter of the electorate was up in the air
right
at that time. And it seems, we don't know this, but it seems like a lot of those undecided went to Paul Young. And a lot of them went to Van Turner. That would be my guess. Judging on, they were the two that did the best on Election Day. Well, Willie Harrington, I think, slightly outpaced Van Turner on Election Day, but still, it seemed to me to be that for sure. And I don't know. I think it was in such a crowded field. Like I said, you're choosing between 4 different visions of the city. Essentially, that's what voters decided to do, and with a couple of strays going elsewhere. But in terms of messaging, Bill, do you think that the undecideds were because the candidates weren't doing a good job articulating themselves, or do you think it was because it was just a tough race to run and it was a tough race to decide?
I think it was a tough race for voters in particular, because I think there was a lot of analysis going on within a voter's head about, if I vote for Van Turner, what am I helping Floyd Bonner to win? I think that was a pretty prevalent consideration for truly undecided voters. I think that for Harrington, even I think some of his supporters too. Although Harrington ran strong this time and ran a good campaign. I mean, we've both talked about this, and in case you don't know it, folks, we talk multiple times a day about, between each other about what's going on.
Hourly
Sometimes, yeah. And we both saw a Harrington campaign this time that he was much more into than he was 4 years ago. You went out with him. You went door to door with Harrington.
Well, not door to door, but on a walk. We went on a walk
Okay.
together. And yeah, I mean, I think he was more engaged. Bill, let me ask you this. He didn't participate in any of the debates. And I was asking Gail Jones Carson this over the phone on Friday. Gail's a longtime Democratic operative and sort of one of the elder statespeople of Memphis city politics in a lot of ways. And I asked her if she thought the lack of debating, which he's never done before, he's never really debated at all. He's participated, I think, one debate in his political career. Could he have brought some undecideds over to him? Do you think that Willie Harrington, if he had made his case in a more general way and not just relied on his historical base, could have taken this election?
No, I don't think so. I think his judgments about what works for him are very precise and are very, very accurate based on being the city's longest serving mayor. He can say things that would just destroy another candidate. I watched him when he was mayor do town hall meetings, and people in a given community might be really lit up by crime, might be saying, we got a crime problem here. Despite what some people think, we've had a crime problem when Harrington was mayor. And I watched him tell those people, what do you want me to do? You want me to put a police officer on every corner? I can't do that. So what is it you want from me on the crime problem? If any other candidate said something like that, the results would be disastrous for them. They would probably be out of the race inside of a week or two after saying something like that. Harrington is Harrington, and he knows he's Harrington. Let's talk some about the council races here, because we now know a little bit more. We don't know everything about the new council, but we knew at the outset there were going to be 5 new members just by incumbents not seeking re-election. So we're still up in the air to some degree about District 7, where Councilwoman Michaeline Easter Thomas is going to a runoff with Jimmy Hassan. She just missed the 50% plus one that she needed to avoid a runoff. So we'll start seeing some of the new council members, I would imagine, on Tuesday, showing up at the council to kind of get the lay of the land on what it's like to actually be in those chairs. Right.
We're going to probably see tomorrow. We'll definitely see Philip Spinoza, who won. I don't know if we'll definitely see him, but we'll District 5 seat, and he won that handily. So we know that seat, and that's clean. We know Jenica White is going to be in her seat replacing Cheyenne Johnson, right? So we know Yolanda Cooper Sutton is taking Martavius Jones's former seat on the council. And so we're going to see those 3, and we have it up in the air. And what's interesting, I think, about that, Bill, is we sort of, we have Jerry Green and Scott McCormick out in District 2 in a runoff, right? But there was this chance for sort of a shift of the politics of the Memphis City Council. And it didn't really happen. We actually probably will keep the status quo depending on the outcome of the District 2 runoff. Wouldn't you say that's true?
Yeah. It turns out that being a former council member who wants to go back on the council after some time off of it does carry some kind of potency in terms of getting elected, although not universally, because Berlin Boyd was a former council member, a former council chairman for 2 terms, was one of the candidates in a very crowded Super District 8 Position 3 contest there, which, as you said, won by Yolanda Cooper Sutton, something of an unknown quantity that remains to be seen. And that's always interesting when someone comes on the council and it was someone who wasn't given much of a chance of winning. We've had it happen before in several instances. And the council's reaction after an election like this is always interesting, because you have 13 people from very different backgrounds a lot of the time who have to find a way to work together, or at least 7 of them do, to get anything done. And that combination of 7 is always up in the air. It's always changing. You very rarely see a council come on there where you have a defined block on everything across the board, all of the important issues. That usually doesn't happen. So the council, after the election is done and in the books, is usually the really interesting group to watch.
Yeah, and to that point, right, Bill, I would ask you this. Philip Spinoza and Megan Keel, both of them spent, as you've pointed out, a ton of money on that race. They raised a ton of money in that District 5 race, which District 5 essentially, goes from, parts of Midtown, Valentine, Evergreen, and stretches all the way east, all the way really down the Poplar Corridor. It is the Poplar Corridor district. And Megan Keel kind of got blown out by Philip Spinoza. And Philip Spinoza capitalized on, he essentially accused Megan Keel of being willing to defund the police. What do you make of that messaging? And do you think that was it? Do you think that because clearly the city did not take an entire rightward tilt toward Floyd Bonner in the mayor's race, but Philip Spinoza overwhelmingly won election over Megan Keel?
I think it worked. I think it started primarily as a whisper campaign, and I think it was devastatingly effective on his part. And then he started putting it on campaign literature and campaign mailers pretty late in the campaign. And she called some press conferences to say, no, look, he's basing this on this statement that I co-signed as part of a statement in the wake of the George Floyd incident with a lot of other nonprofit leaders. And we didn't call for defunding the police as in the police go out of existence. But I think we know now that by then it was probably a foregone conclusion. I mean, Spinoza won that race without the need of a runoff, and a lot of us thought it was going to go to a runoff.
Right. And so I would ask you this. She called some press conferences, right?
Mm-hmm.
But she only really addressed that she had an ad. She did make some TV ad buys, and she did address it during that ad.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that, earlier TV buys, if she had even preempted or even run on a message of safety, and tried to really emphasize safety before she could be accused of that, do you think that would have helped her out? Or was this always going to kind of be a solidly right of center seat, though it's a nonpartisan race?
Well, this goes to the theory I have about how the city at large swings on crime. And it does swing. It's a pendulum. It's still really an uphill climb to say, well, I don't think the police should be paid everything we have in the city treasury, and I don't think that the police should be able to do whatever they want without being questioned. If you say that, you're going to get painted that way if you're running against someone who wants to beat you. And everybody running in these races wants to win one way or another. So what I saw in the gap between early voting and election day, some attack ads that were paid for by, I believe, Justin Pearson's PAC. And there's so much more to come in terms of a story on the PAC spending that we'll have once we have some numbers on that. But it went right at Spinoza, calling him a quitter. Several voices on the screen from people saying, well, he's a quitter. He's a quitter. He quit the council in 2018, 2 years into the term. That might have had some outcome, some effect on the outcome of the election had it hit sooner. I mean, I think that the defund police attack was happening so often, so early, that repetition was the only thing to answer it with.
And so in terms of that, in terms of the negative ads back to the mayor's race, because we talk about this, in terms of what's to come with the PAC, Justin Pearson, State Representative Justin Pearson raised an absolute ton of money in the wake of his expulsion from the Tennessee House of Representatives. Some of that money was transferred to a PAC. And when Pearson endorsed Van Turner, among others, that money swung into gear and sort of tried to help both Van Turner and then I guess Megan Keel as well.
Yeah.
And so that money, we haven't seen how much it was. There are rumors. The Tennessee Lookout has reported that it was north of $100,000 towards Turner and allocated spending. We haven't seen that in actual state election campaign finance filings. Those come out actually next year because of the way the law works. So that's when we'll know this. But to your point, Bill, maybe you could flesh this out a little more for me. The earliness of both those attack ads, they came late in the campaign. They didn't really come at the start of early voting. And then just essentially the Turner surge that we did see, because he did quite well on election day versus early voting. Mm-hmm. Do you think that swings the outcome of the mayor's race if it's 10 days earlier or 20 days earlier?
No, I think that Vance had a blue wave strategy. You cannot start a wave too early and expect it to pan out. It's going to be a late breaking strategy by design. And that's what he needed. He needed a blue wave strategy to win. That said, I think that the strategy will also have some repercussions in future elections. He did well with it. He didn't raise as much money as either Floyd Bonner or Paul Young did, which was a disappointment to him, I'm sure. But given what he did with what he got in terms of funding, and everybody was using a ton of mail this year. I mean, your mailbox every day that you went to it, you had pieces from different candidates in there. So it was real mail-driven too. And there were attack ads before the break between early voting and election day. The difference was the attack ads were done directly by the different candidates. So you saw a lot of that out there too. But no, I don't. I think that Turner's strategy was very deliberate, was very well done, and it did what it could. That's why you see a blue wave work in county elections, which are partisan, but you don't in city elections.
And to that point, Bill, there are two things that sort of are next and that will dictate our next city election, Memphis municipal election, and that's whether or not we're going to have partisan elections in the city of Memphis and whether or not we're going to get rid of runoffs. So what do you think of each of those in terms of their effect, and how likely do you think each of them is going to come to pass?
Well, the council is scheduled to have first reading votes on 2 ballot questions. Folks, if you're voting next year and you live in the city, you've already got 4 ballot questions on there to decide. These are 2 more, and both of them could go on there. I think that more council members are willing to bring back the runoff provision for the mayor's race and for the super district council members. We already have it for districts 1 through 7. I think more council members are willing to do that than they are to allow the parties to call for primaries in advance of city elections. That's where I see, do you have 7 votes or not?
And so if you had a runoff here and let's just play the hypothetical game, because like I said at the top, history's written from the side of the victor and everything. It's all Paul Young right now because Paul Young was the first man past the poll. If it had been Paul Young and Floyd Bonner, what do you think happens?
I think Young would have prevailed in the runoff by a wider margin than he did in this general nonpartisan election. I don't think it would have been any contest at all.
Why do you think that?
Because I think you would have seen Harrington and Turner's forces aligned behind Young in the race. And Harrington's kind of a guess because he can be unpredictable at times. And remember that Harrington had been critical of both Young and Bonner by name during the campaign. Each one of them he called out by name.
The 2 guys who finished ahead of him.
Right. So,
but he thought he was winning the entire time.
But well, and he had some reason for that, I think. He like I said, he was into it. He was enjoying himself out there. This is probably the best campaign that he's run since 2003, I would say. So there was some reason for it. But I think ultimately he would have come down behind Young. And
so looking at the vote maps, because Cole Perry of Perry Strategies, who's a very bright guy, was working for the Bonner campaign, visualized the votes and visualized the maps. And what you can really see with the votes is that Harrington did best in essentially the southern parts of the city, Whitehaven, Westwood, out to Van Turner did pretty well at Hickory Hill out east, and then up into Fraser and Raleigh. That's where Harrington did the best. And then Turner and Bonner sort of split the Papa corridor, it seemed. And Young did a little better in other precincts than Bonner did. Would it be fair to say, looking at that map, because the map Bonner, when you see where Bonner did the best, it's very much the east side of the Papa corridor. Was he sort of the Republican candidate in this race? He was endorsed essentially by the Republican Party. Did we see sort of the Republican partisans support him and not much else?
Yeah, they made some endorsements in some of the council races, including notably Philip Spinoza in District 5, because I think they saw an opportunity there. But yeah, he was essentially the Republican candidate, even though he is the Democratic sheriff. He won the Democratic primaries. But you can't forget that in 2022, the Republicans didn't even hold a primary to draft a challenger to him running for re-election as sheriff. That was a huge move. That's the first time in the 30-year history of county primaries, that the Republicans decided not to do a sheriff's race, which is normally a very contentious race. Even when it wasn't partisan, it was a contentious race. Now, I think Bonner has never been challenged in his 2 runs for office prior to this, the way that he was in this campaign. And I think he was somewhat bewildered by it, because he's really gone with just bringing the maximum amount of force possible to running for sheriff and not encountering much resistance there or opposition there. He did in this case, and I think ultimately his campaign was not prepared for that. And as a candidate, he was not prepared for that. The mayor's race is the real thing. There is a difference between city and county elections, and we saw it here. I also think that a lot of the people who were donating to his campaign, some of them lived in Memphis, but I think the people who, people tell candidates all the time, yeah, I'll vote for you. I'm going to vote for you. You got my vote. You definitely got my vote. And a lot of those people, depending on what your appeal is, don't live in the city. And I think that's what he encountered in a pretty significant way here. People telling him, attaboy, go out there and win this race and you have my support, but not telling him, by the way, I don't live in the city, so I can't vote in this race. And the Election Commission even had people who were calling in and saying, I live outside of the city. What do you mean I can't vote in the Memphis elections? I should be able to.
Yeah, and to that point, before we wrap up here, I think one of the things is a factor in terms of Bonner's support in that way, in terms of people being outside the county, is back in 2019, all police officers, essentially most police officers and most firefighters lived in the city. New hires couldn't live outside the city. State law has changed. Now they can. And I'm very curious, to be honest. The Memphis Police Association, the Memphis Fire Association endorsed Bonner, and they worked very hard for him. But I'm curious if their voting block was as strong as it was in 2019 than it was this time, in terms of they might have just diluted some of their numbers by not living in the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's also a factor. That those 2 firefighters and police officers are a voting block. They do vote. That, it means something to have those endorsements. It means more than just cash behind your campaign from the unions. It translates to votes. I mean, we've seen both of those unions get together and put the ballot question on the ballot that raised the sales tax rate in order to bring back benefits that police and firefighters had lost in 2014. And that was no small chore, given the fact that the council basically refused to put that question on the ballot.
Right.
They'll put about any other question on the ballot, but not that one. So yeah, I think that probably was a factor in this. It's hard to pin down factors because no 2 voters look at something the same way. So who knows what the motives are going in there and voting and how people make decisions. It may be an endorsement ballot that they got handed shortly before they walked into the voting place. That's a common practice here in Memphis. It might not be so common in future elections because more and more polling places are ruling out that practice, not just at the 100-foot marker by state law, but on their property, period, if they're a polling place.
That could be very interesting, particularly down ballot, where people sometimes just pick a name on the list.
Mm-hmm. And if they got a ballot in their hand that they got walking across the parking lot, you may be a winner today if you're on that ballot. So I think that's where we will leave it for this edition. Again, November 16th, runoff elections in districts 2, 3, and 7 coming up. We'll be writing much more about that. For Sam Hardiman, I'm Bill Dries. This has been On the Record.